Welcome everybody, and thanks for coming along. For those that don't know me, I'm Matt Duncan, Associate Director at Carbon Financial. Just like to welcome you to our political briefing with Andy Maciver this afternoon. Now, I'm sure most of you will have seen Andy either on TV or heard him on radio, read his comments in the papers over the recent years, but for anybody that doesn't know Andy, he's co-founder of Message Matters, a lobbying and PR consultancy firm, and he's going to chat through today his thoughts on the current climate in Scottish and UK politics. The format for the session is going to be a 30-minute presentation from Andy, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. So on that note, any questions that are on your mind just now, or anything that comes up whilst Andy chats through his presentation, if you could just use the chat function to pop the questions in there, and we'll put them to Andy afterwards. On that note, I'll hand over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Matt. Afternoon to everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen here. Matt will confirm, no doubt, in a couple of seconds whether or not that has actually worked. I think, Matt, you should see my screen now.
All good.
Okay, so let's go into presentation. Oh, hold on, sorry about that. Managed to, screen has managed to go into entirely the wrong place. Right, let's try that again, shall we? Right, there we go. Matt, are you seeing that okay?
Yes, all good, Andy.
Great. Okay, we'll get kicked off. So again, welcome everybody. What I'll try and do is I'll do a little run through of what happened at the Holyrood elections, which seem rather a long time ago now, but actually only about 6 months ago. And then we'll skip on to talk about the cooperation agreement between the Greens and the SNP, which is quite a material issue, which is having its impact still now. You probably heard Nicola Sturgeon's announcement yesterday about the Cambo oil field, though that is a direct result of the drip feed change in policy created by the cooperation agreement. We'll then talk about IndyRef 2. I'm afraid you can't talk about Scottish politics without talking about IndyRef 2, so you're going to have to endure that as well. And then we'll finish on a bit of discussion about Westminster, because actually Westminster is now the critical place for decision making on what happens, both in IndyRef 2 and in other areas of Scottish politics at this point as well. The next election you're all going to be asked to vote in, other than the council elections next year, is almost certainly a Westminster election, which will be in the next couple of years. So let's crack on with that. The election we just had in May was touted as, quite correctly, including by me, touted as probably the most important election that we've had since devolution. And the reason for that was because there was a general expectation that the SNP might be able to get another majority, as they did in 2011. And that may lead to another independence referendum. And indeed, that was the thought of Downing Street at that point as well, which I'll go through in a second. In the end, as we all know, the SNP fell slightly short of a majority on 64. And as you can see on that chart there, which compares 2016 to 2021, the change was actually very small across the board. No party changed, no party won or lost more than 2 seats. So Labour lost 2, the Greens won 2, Lib Dems lost 1, SNP won 1, and the Tories stayed the same. So actually things were very, very similar mathematically after the election to what they were before, but politically they were quite different. You can see there, I'll just put up a couple of maps, the constituency one and the regional one. I'm not going to give you an explainer on the system, you'll all know it well enough by now, but obviously we have constituency seats which are elected on a standard first past the post basis, and you can see those there. There was a degree of change in that the SNP won a couple of seats in the south of Scotland, one from the Tories and one from Labour. Otherwise, they were reasonably stable. The important seat there, actually, from the point of view of the outcome of the election, is actually the kidney-shaped red seat in the west of Scotland. That's West Dunbartonshire, that's Jackie Bailey's seat. And it was the most vulnerable seat in Scotland. She had a majority of about 100, just over 100, and the SNP expected to take that seat. And as it got to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning on election night, it became clear that that was going to be the seat that would decide whether or not the SNP got their majority. In the end, Jackie Bailey actually, against all odds, increased her majority quite substantially. And because of that, the SNP were stuck on 64 seats and did not get to that 65 seat majority. You can see here, this is the additional member seats. So these are elected by the so-called top-up system. The reason the SNP didn't actually gain too many, they only gained one seat despite winning first past the post seats, is that effectively it's not a perfect model, but effectively if you win first past the post seats, you then lose list seats, you lose additional member seats. And the SNP's 2 seats that they won in the south of Scotland, Ayr and East Lothian, they lost them on the list, and so they effectively remained the same. And their gain from 63 to 64 was that yellow dot up in the Highlands and Islands, which was a genuine gain of a seat based on support on the list. So that is what made the difference. That's how we got to 64. Now, we'll go into the reason why the majority, despite not being legally or constitutionally important, it was very, very politically important for 2 reasons. One was that it led to the requirement for a cooperation agreement with the Greens, which we'll go into now. But secondly, because it gave Downing Street what it felt was cover to deny the opportunity for a second independence referendum, and we'll go into that in a second. But we'll talk first about the cooperation agreement. The cooperation agreement can be seen as being something which sits somewhere in between a formal coalition of the type that, for example, the Tories and the Lib Dems went into with David Cameron and Nick Clegg. It's a formal coalition agreement. And on the other end of the scale, what might be called a confidence and supply agreement, which is similar to what Theresa May and the DUP went into after the 2017 election. This is somewhere in between. And the basic facets of a cooperation agreement, which is most famously seen in the past in New Zealand, is that the smaller party will agree to support the bigger party on a range of specifically defined policy measures, but they will be free to oppose that party on other measures. In other words, the small party gets to keep their stick to beat the big party with, but the big party gets a degree of certainty over certain things. And that's exactly why the SNP went into this agreement. So you might fairly say to yourself, well, look, they had 63 seats before, and they perfectly capably managed to stay in power during that 5-year period. They managed to pass budgets and so on and so forth, and they managed to get policy through. So why is it so different on 64? In fact, it should be, they've gained a seat, so why do they need to go into this? And I think that's actually a perfectly fair question. My assessment would be that if you look at risk and opportunity, I think that more of the risk in this arrangement is shared by the SNP and more of the opportunity is shared by the Greens. But to understand why the SNP went into it in the first place, you really need to understand the psyche of the leadership there. They were extremely spooked by what started to go on in the latter half of the last Parliament. So the SNP started to lose votes in Parliament, mostly on fairly minor policy issues, but they started to be defeated because the Greens effectively were unpredictable in terms of where they were going to go on certain votes. And if all the rest of the unionist opposition effectively ganged up on the SNP, and if the Greens either abstained or voted against, then the SNP were beginning to lose votes. And the thing that spooked them the most was that John Swinney, the Education Secretary, in a vote that was brought on by the exams crisis during COVID, was potentially looking at losing his job in a vote of no confidence. And the Greens had initially indicated they were going to vote against the government and eventually then fell in line and voted for them. But that really scared the SNP leadership because Swinney is extremely important. John Swinney is extremely important to the SNP internally and in terms of their government. So one of the very specific lines that was drawn into the cooperation agreement was that the Green Party must support the SNP government in confidence motions and in budgets. So what that does is it takes all the uncertainty out of confidence motions and budgets for the SNP. They know they are safe. They know that they can't be removed. They know that none of their people can be removed in votes of no confidence, and that's important to them. But it is a high stakes move for 2 reasons, and I'll just reverse the way I talk about those actually. Firstly, when it comes to the second independence referendum, if it indeed happens, and as I say, we'll go through that in a second, they have a major problem with the business community. That problem has been exacerbated by COVID and their COVID response, which is generally speaking seen to have been less business friendly than the UK government's COVID response has been. If you look back to Indy Ref 1, effectively one of the main reasons why the SNP and the Scottish and the Yes campaign did not win the first independence referendum is because the business community and those with higher paid jobs, higher paying taxpayers, those with prospects, in large part, polling will tell you that they did not vote yes, they voted no. So it's quite an important, and that was under Alex Salmond, who was, seen to be a friend of the business community. It is really important for the prospects for Indy Ref 2 that the Yes campaign and the SNP government are seen to be more business friendly, or they simply won't get those votes. Going into a cooperation agreement with a very left-wing Green Party is not the way to do that. So it's a risk from that point of view. And the other risk is actually about the next election. The SNP famously are very reticent to even hint that they might be prepared to let some SNP voters vote for another pro-independence party on the regional list ballot, on the basis that those votes are largely wasted, because as you saw in the previous chart, the SNP take their seats from the constituency and not from the list. But what this cooperation agreement does is it really allows the Green Party to say in 2026, look, there is no point in voting SNP on the regional list vote. You don't return any SNP MSPs through that list. You may as well vote for us. You're going to get us in government anyway, so you may as well vote for us. And instead of having a government with a majority of 5 or 6, you could have a government with a majority of 15 or 16 or 25 or 26. And you could massively cement the prospects of a second independence referendum thereafter. So I think they have really given the Greens their election strategy on a bit of a plate, and it's high risk from their point of view. Of course, there are risks from the Green point of view as well, and the main one is, can they actually cut it in government? It's a very open question. You have 2 government ministers, Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater. Lorna Slater has been quite controversial already in some of her tweets and some of her comments. But she has some private sector experience. She worked for a renewable energy company before becoming an MSP. So she has a bit of understanding of the world outside of politics. Patrick Harvie doesn't hugely have much understanding of the world outside of politics. He's a lifelong campaigner. And as all former ministers and government special advisors will tell you, the first rule of being a government minister is not to allow perfection to get in the way of good. And they've really spent a lifetime, and the Green Party is the expert at allowing perfection to get in the way of good. And it's a big test for these two as to whether or not they can adapt from being effectively campaigners, which is what they have been, and turn themselves into effective government ministers. So the risk for the Green Party is that they actually just don't cut it as government ministers, and they are seen to have underperformed, and that may therefore harm their chances. But as I said, I think generally speaking, this cooperation agreement is more of a risk for the SNP than it is for the Greens, and conversely more of an opportunity for the Greens than it is for the SNP. It's also changing quite a lot of policy. And that's where things start to get very interesting for a whole range of organisations. And, I'm sure some of those on this call will be part of some of the industries that I have listed here. I mentioned already with Cambo, we're already starting to see a moderate shift in oil and gas policy. It will never be a complete shift because the Greens, as you will know, want to stop extracting oil and gas immediately, including existing reserves and existing fields, whereas the SNP are in favour of a transition, understanding the problems that will be major unemployment problems in particular that would be onset by a cliff edge in that respect. But by saying today that Cambo should not go ahead, that was a very significant announcement by Nicola Sturgeon yesterday. In fact, John Swinney slightly tried to row back on it this morning. But it's a significant announcement. It marks a massive change in policy for the SNP. And it's another example of just a little bit of the drip feed fallout from COP, drip feed from the cooperation agreement, changing policy. The same is happening on road building. There are a couple of major trunk road building programs ongoing right now, the A9 and the A96. A9 has obviously been going on for a while. The A96 has been agreed already in terms of it being dualled. But the government has now said that both of those are back on the table, and the A96 dualling will probably now not happen. And there is even a risk of the A9 dualling not happening as well. There are other roads that people are looking at being upgraded. The A82, the A75, the A77. All of those things are now in quite serious jeopardy as a result of this agreement, and different solutions might have to be found. Fish farming, another industry, big industry for Scotland. Obviously, the SNP are pretty keen on it generally because it provides jobs in remote and rural areas and it's a massive export. But the Greens despise fish farming and effectively want a moratorium on salmon farming immediately. Perhaps more than any other sector, the private rented sector, I think, is under massive pressure as a result of this agreement. It already was, even just with the SNP in government, and now with the Greens in government, the outlook for regulation in the PRS is really pretty significant. And finally, on social policy, potentially pretty significant implications on social policy as well, most notably in gender recognition legislation, which will be a big political hot potato in the years to come. It's not going anywhere soon. So let's turn our attention now then to IndyRef 2, the subject that everybody wants to hear and everybody wants to talk about all the time. Some people get excited about it, some people roll their eyes about it, some people get angry about it, but it's a topic that's pretty much on everybody's lips most of the time. This graph, just to introduce us to where we are in this debate at the moment, and hopefully you guys aren't looking at this in too small a screen, but the darker, the bolder grey line near the top of the screen, that is the result of the referendum in 2014. Anything, and the slightly more mild grey line right in the middle at 0% is obviously the 0% mark, as it suggests. Anything above that on the gold line is a lead for no, and anything below it is a lead for yes. So as you can see, no has led in the polls pretty much most of the time, almost all of the time, since 2014, but it hasn't often gone above the mark it set itself in that referendum. So only for a very short amount of time, actually just when Theresa May took over the Tory party, in fact, was it above the mark they set for themselves in 2014. It has largely been a case of the gap narrowing. And then as we went through the Boris Johnson era, you can see that the gold line dips below the 0%. In other words, it goes into a yes lead, just as Boris Johnson takes over as Prime Minister. And the lead becomes quite strong right through to the kind of midpoint of last year. And one of the main reasons it actually started to rise again was the vaccine rollout programme, which increased positive sentiment towards the UK once again, and has pushed no back into the lead for the first time in really about 12 months or so. So that's the territory which we're talking about. Bear in mind, though, as I move on to the next few slides, that it has always been a fairly clear objective within the Yes campaign and within the SNP that they want to be polling at about 60% for a solid 12 months before they really particularly want a referendum. Now, on the basis of this chart, 60% is off the chart at the bottom of the chart. So they are nowhere near that, and they haven't really threatened being anywhere near that. So there's quite a lot of risk involved from that side of things at the moment as well. I mentioned earlier on about the majority. Now, one of the reasons why we are not looking at a referendum, the main reason, frankly, why we're not looking at a second referendum right now, is because of the fact that the SNP did not return 65 seats in the May election. 65 is the majority in the Scottish Parliament, but the Scottish Parliament is a proportional representation parliament. So if you asked any election expert from another country to come in and say, does the SNP have a mandate for its manifesto? All of those people would say, yes, of course it does, because it's a PR parliament. You're not supposed to get a majority. The whole point about proportional representation is that you work with other parties, and if you agree a deal with other parties to support your government, then you're in government and you have a mandate. So from a democratic point of view, and this is, I hope, an impartial point, there is a mandate for a referendum. However, politically, 65 really matters, and it mattered hugely. Because the whole election was built around the prospect of the SNP getting a majority. The SNP whilst trying to dampen it at some points, pretty much talked up their ability to get that, and started to say that if they did get a majority, there is absolutely no way that anybody could deny a referendum. So with all that in mind, the UK government privately before the election, although publicly they said no, without any question there won't be one, privately they were understanding, they were admitting, and they were strategizing about how to handle a second independence referendum. They thought that if the SNP got 65, they would have to give another referendum, and they were preparing for how that would take shape and what that would be. The fact that they then got 64 gave Downing Street all the cover it wanted to simply say no. And the expansion in the polls over the last few months since the election, the positive expansion in the polls for the no campaign, has just increased that bullishness to the point where the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, in the corner there, who you may know, he's not a hugely public figure, but you will perhaps recognise him nonetheless. A few weeks ago at Tory Party conference, he set a new bar for what would be required in order to have a second independence referendum. And those 3 points that you can see on the screen were the bar that he set. And these are not ors, these are ands. So he said it would have to be 25 years. So that's the year 2039 would be the 25-year mark since 2014. And there would have to be 60% support to have a referendum for 12 months in a row. And there would have to be 60% support for independence in polls for 12 months in a row. So that's the equivalent of taking the IndyRef 2 ball and kicking it as far into the long grass as the eye can possibly see. Now, realistically, that's probably not a sustainable position, but that is the position that they've got at the moment. This extract here is from the Scottish Government's programme for government. They have promised to deliver a referendum within the first half of this Parliament. So what does that mean? Well, we started this Parliament 6 months ago. So the first half of this Parliament will take us to the autumn, November, roundabout right now actually, of 2023. That is also roughly when we expect a UK general election to take place. That will be the 4-year point of Boris Johnson's government. It's very difficult to see him going beyond that, depending on what the polls, of course, say at that point. But it's pretty difficult to see him going beyond that, and we think there will be an election at the latest by then. What that basically means is that there is almost zero chance of there being an independence referendum in the first half of this Parliament. So between now and 2 years from now, 2023, we find it exceptionally unlikely to think there will be an independence referendum. However, there could be one after. So there could be one in the second half of the Scottish parliamentary term, so somewhere between autumn of 2023 and the election of 2026. But at the moment, it is likely that the only way that will be delivered is if the SNP put in a massive performance in that general election. And by massive performance, I mean that they probably need to do something similar to what they did in 2015. So winning somewhere in the mid-50s of seats. There are only 59 seats in Scotland, bear in mind. So winning almost all of the seats, all of the Scottish seats at the Westminster election is probably what they will need to do in order for the UK government to think about whether or not it might have to grant a second referendum. That is the current UK government thinking, that this is absolutely on hold with no discussion until that election, and they will consider the result that the SNP get. I stress this is not the public position, this is the private position, that they will think about the result the SNP achieve in that election and think about whether or not that makes the denial of a referendum unsustainable, because you can bet the campaign, as all campaigns recently have been, will be fought on that basis. The reason they think they can continue to do this is because they don't see where Nicola Sturgeon can go with this. And they have a point strategically. We have a situation where Nicola Sturgeon won the election with a landslide, but the UK government have said no to the referendum on the basis of that manifesto and that mandate. She has already said she's not going to have a wildcat referendum. That's not a bluff. There is no way that Nicola Sturgeon will want to do that. primarily because she's very worried about the impact on her relationship and the Scottish Government's relationship with the EU. The EU are already sceptical about independence anyway, simply because of the prevalence of countries like Spain, for instance, which has a separation problem. And they are already pretty sceptical about the mechanisms for this. And the last thing they will want to recognise is any kind of wildcat referendum. So there's no way that Nicola Sturgeon wants to do that. She wants it to be run on the exact same basis as 2014. In other words, with a bilateral agreement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government to deliver that referendum in a quote-unquote legal way. In the absence of that taking place, the UK Government are not sure what she can really do about it. And they think that she will continue to come under internal pressure to outline what her referendum strategy is. And they are hoping that there is some form of implosion in the Yes movement and in the SNP over the fact that they don't seem to have a mechanism to deliver a referendum. That's probably wishful thinking, not least because Nicola Sturgeon is really under no internal pressure at all in terms of her leadership. And indeed, she's been given very good foil by Alex Salmond's Alba party, because at the moment, anybody who disagrees or wants to rock the boat is very swiftly shown the door, marked Alba party, and wished all the best of luck. But that's what the UK Government think is potentially going to happen, and it will be interesting to see how much of that indeed does come true. The same excerpt that I put up earlier on there outlines that there's also going to be a detailed prospectus for an independent Scotland coming within the next couple of years, and that in itself will be very interesting, because the backdrop for that detailed prospectus is quite different than it was before. 4 cabinet ministers round the outside of your screen there: Shirley Ann Somerville on education, Humza Yousaf on health, Angela Constance on drugs, and Kate Forbes on the economy, are briefs that are under significantly more pressure now than they were 5 years ago, and certainly more pressure now than they were 10 years ago. There is just a general perception that government performance is not where it was. That's not all the fault of Nicola Sturgeon and her government. Some of it is just simply the fault of the passage of time, in that much of what Scotland has been doing over the last 20 years has been talking about independence, instead of focusing on the necessary reform of some of the public services. And there's a general feeling that some of those chickens are coming home to roost. Let me move on to Westminster before we go to questions. I'm aware that time is cracking on a little bit. I want to leave plenty of time for all the questions or any questions that you may wish to ask. But Westminster is where our focus now shifts. Holyrood has been dealt with. We might even see a bit of a lull in Holyrood politics over the next couple of years. You know, if there's no prospect of a referendum, there will be a bit of agitation at Holyrood. There will be bills laid asking for Section 30 orders and so on. But actually, Holyrood might have a period of focusing more on domestic policy, whereas the main constitutional policy and the main interest might shift to Westminster. This is polling for a general election. This polling goes back to the start of last year, the start of 2020. Obviously, needless to say, Tories in blue, Labour in red. And what you started to see at the start of 2020 was a pretty big upswing in polling for the Tory party. That was right at the start of COVID, when things began to get dicey. Boris Johnson then went into hospital with COVID, and that's where his opinion, or the Tory opinion ratings, peaked. At one point, there was a couple of polls actually which had the Tories at over 55%, which is historically very, very unusual. Even over 50% is extremely unusual. But then after he came out of hospital and Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, replacing Jeremy Corbyn, things started to reverse to a degree. Tory polling went down, Labour polling went up in a sort of natural way. As COVID performance started to be questioned, it began to just about level itself up. And you can see there by the end of 2020, start of 2021, there started to be a bit more equivalence in polling, and the parties were about neck and neck on 40%. The reason then the blue bar goes back up and the red bar goes back down is very simply to do with the vaccine programme. Boris Johnson, being associated with what was regarded by everybody really as a world-leading vaccine rollout, and the fact that he was able to point to effectively a UK vaccine did him huge favours in the polls. But as you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, things have started to change again, and there's no question that the current sleaze issue that we're mired in, I in fact was on TV discussing it last night, where I very popularly, as you can imagine, said that I thought MPs needed to get paid more money. That is taking its toll on the Tory party, without question. And Labour, for the first time in a long time, have taken the lead in the polls. You can see there that graph speaks for itself. Really, that's Boris Johnson's approval rating. So his negatives are rising quite quickly now, to be honest, and his positives are dropping by the same amount, and that has been happening really since the summertime. This is when the vaccine effect started to wear off a little bit. People start to forget that your guy is the guy who's done the first vaccine, and once everybody else is in a similar place in the vaccine rollout program, voters forget these things quite easily, to be honest. So his ratings are suffering now. That chap sitting on the desk in the Oval Office is the guy called Frank Luntz, for those of you who don't know, and it'd be completely understandable if you didn't. He is a Republican pollster in the US. His view is that Boris is quite like a US politician. The obvious comparison is Trump. I've never thought that was a fair comparison, but actually he compares him with a whole host of US politicians in that, their presidential style leads to very much an individualized vote. His view, and that's his quote, is that Boris is a rock star. He actually thinks that Boris Johnson is almost immune to what's happening in his own government and immune to what's happening in the Conservative Party. In other words, he thinks that the government could become unpopular and that the Tory party could become unpopular, but that Boris Johnson himself will remain popular and will therefore be able to win a general election. It's an interesting theory. I can understand why he thinks that is what might happen. Boris Johnson is a formidable campaigner. There's no question about it. He's incredible talent in campaigning, and he's proven himself to be a real winner. But there's a lot that's taking its toll now. And I think Boris Johnson is at risk of being in the centre of the perfect storm here when it comes to electoral politics. Taxes are now higher than they have been for many, many, many decades, and that's under a Tory government. We saw, I think, just this morning, inflation was up at 4.2%. I don't think anybody expects there'll be many people on this call who are far more qualified than me on the issue of inflation and interest rates, but I think the general expectation, it's fair to say, is that both of those measures will start to go up. We know that energy prices are going to go up for the foreseeable future, and with really no prospect whatsoever of them coming down anytime soon. Potential other supply shortages as well, and of course the sleaze issue, which might dampen, but might not entirely go away. And certainly you can tell by the way the press are dealing with it, even the sympathetic press, the Tory sympathetic press are dealing with it, that they think this is a big issue that's going to hang around for quite some time. But the question is, does the other guy have the ability to capitalise on that? Can Keir Starmer be Prime Minister? Because his approval ratings aren't that good either. In fact, his negatives are the same as Boris Johnson, and his positives are lower than Boris Johnson. So only 1 in 5 of the population thinks that Keir Starmer is doing well. And in polls I've conducted on other presentations that I've been doing, what's been pretty marked is that people would choose the neither option over Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. So he is not doing terribly well either. His position is difficult. He was an arch Remainer, and he's from the south. And obviously the big problem Labour had at the last election was that they lost so many seats in the so-called Red Wall. And that was pretty much on the basis of Brexit, because those traditional Labour seats and traditional Labour voters felt that Boris Johnson, this Etonian Prime Minister from the Tory party, they thought that he understood them better than the Labour Party did at the time, obviously under Jeremy Corbyn. So Starmer's ability to understand the Red Wall, to understand the levelling up agenda, to understand how to make Brexit work, which is this new catchphrase indicating at least that he does get the agenda up there, is going to be pretty critical as to his future and how he does. And whether he can also be the adult in the room on the second jobs and sleaze issue, which is quite difficult for him, given that he earned a lot of money as a lawyer before he became Labour leader, but when he was still an MP. And I think the big question at this point for Starmer is, who is he? Is he Tony Blair or is he Neil Kinnock? In other words, we had a situation 40 years ago where the Labour Party had to recover from having Michael Foot as its leader. Similarly, we have a situation at the moment where the Labour Party has to recover from having Jeremy Corbyn as its leader, in a very similar situation where, you know, they lost touch with ordinary people. They went very, very, very heavily to the left, and they have a recovery to do from that. Neil Kinnock is the person who created that Labour recovery, who changed the internal politics of the Labour Party, who laid the foundation for Labour to win again. But he was not the person who won, he lost. Tony Blair was the person who won. And I think the big question about Keir Starmer now, when he first took over, everybody presumed that he was Tony Blair. He may not be, he may be Neil Kinnock. He may be the person who makes the party credible again, but ultimately who is left to lay the foundations for the next person to come along, for the Tony Blair to come along, which at the moment looks like it would probably be somebody like Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. So that's the big question for Labour and Starmer. When it comes to 2 years' time, to 2023, has he made the elevation to become Tony Blair, or ultimately, is he just the guy that makes things slightly better, but then leaves it for the next person to actually win? I'm going to leave you just with one slide. You'll recognise this chap, I'm sure, Michael Gove. Michael Gove is a figure of sometimes ridicule, sometimes fun, sometimes love, sometimes hate, controversial person for sure. But there's no doubt that he is an exceptional political strategist, and is seen to really deliver on the portfolios that he has. And at the moment, he's Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and also the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations. But most importantly, Michael Gove is effectively in charge of everything that happens outside of London. He's in charge of the strategy for English regions, mayors, devolution. He's in charge of the strategy for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And his approach to devolution and to the devolved governments is to kill them with kindness. He wants to be their friend. He wants to make sure that they have everything that they need. He doesn't mind if they get the credit for it, because his view of how the union works, because ultimately the unionist problem here is that the union is not that popular. That's ultimately where we are. And his view of how you make that different is to show that the union can work for everybody. That's his long-term goal. And the impacts of that could be very, very interesting to see. Matt, that's the end of the formalities. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and that should be us back to camera.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. That was extremely informative. Various questions we had submitted beforehand, and actually one I'll just pick up on there that's related to your recent point, and then there's one that's coming from guests as we've gone along. Somebody's asked, is devolution sustainable, or does it have to go one way or the other in terms of or less?
So that's to a degree that's a subjective question, and my answer to that would be, I think devolution as a concept and an institution is sustainable. There's no question it could work forever. But I think it's very unlikely that the specific form of devolution that we have right now is going to last. It's not really particularly popular with anybody. And I think as I did several years ago for clients, where one of my clients wanted to model what a third option would look like, you know, something that people sometimes call federalism or sometimes call home rule, effectively an enhanced form of devolution where you probably have control of corporation tax, you probably have control of that now that we're out of the EU, you probably have more control of, you pretty much have control of all taxes, and you retain foreign affairs, perhaps pensions, perhaps some other things at Westminster. That always comes out as the most popular option in any form of polling. And I think the likelihood is that if the union is to survive, it will be a looser type of union. It will be a union that is less London-centric, And that doesn't just go for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that goes for the English regions as well. I think the ceding of power to mayors will continue in the north of England and other places, and the devolution of power to the assemblies and governments will continue as well. So my view would be that we either go down the route of independence, and I think there's a bit of a domino effect. I think if Scotland goes, that changes the debate in Northern Ireland quite substantially. I wouldn't necessarily include Wales in that. I think that's different. But I think if Scotland goes, then the Northern Ireland goes right to the top of the risk register and probably follows not that long thereafter. So that's one option. But I think that the only long-term option for the survival of the union is to quite substantially change the way it works, make it much looser, probably have some form of written constitution in there, probably change the House of Lords into some sort of federal parliament and the House of Commons into some sort of English parliament, and effectively run it that way in the long term. That's in my view the likeliest way that the union will survive.
Super, thank you very much. One question's just come in there. Could you put the independence polling graph up again and explain the black line at 0% in relation to the 2014 result and the 60% bar?
Yes, I absolutely can. Bear with me. I'll just share the screen again and do that, which should be happening in a moment. Okay, let's go back to that. Hold on a second. Right. Where was it? I take it you can see that, Matt, yeah?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, that's perfect, yeah.
Yep, there we are. Okay, so just play that there. Sorry, I probably didn't explain this brilliantly at the time. I'll try and zoom in a little bit on it. The thick black line at the top, that is the result of the 2014 referendum. So that was a 55-45 referendum, which is a 10-point lead for no. So that's why that line comes right in the middle of the 8 and 12% up the left-hand side. So the thick black line is the last result. The thinner greyish line at 0% is exactly what it suggests. That would be a 50-50 polling return, that 0%. So when the gold line is above 0%, that's a lead for the no campaign. And when the gold line is below 0%, that's a lead for the yes campaign. So you can see that between the end of 2019 and the end of 2020, that's when that gold line was underneath the light grey line. So that represented a lead for the yes campaign. And the maximum lead was about 8%. And that is therefore a 54-46 margin. So about the best the SNP, I should say, pardon me, the yes campaign has ever done in polls is to be at round about 54%. And as I mentioned earlier on, their level of comfort is more like 60% than 54. I'll just stop sharing that now. Hopefully that clears that up. And apologies if I was a little vague on that slide earlier on when I had it up.
Super, thanks, Andy. Just a related question's just come in there on independence. Could Westminster call the SNP's bluff by offering a Ref2 in the near future? Were the no vote to win again, as polls suggest, would the SNP be terminally damaged?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And it's a question that we talk about quite a lot, actually. And, I think it's fair to say that it's very unlikely. I think it's extremely unlikely. But that's largely because the UK government is petrified of referendums, absolutely petrified of them. They know that referendums can change things. You just have to look at Brexit. They know that sometimes there can be surprises in referendums that you don't expect. And the last thing they want is another Scottish independence referendum because they think it's too big a risk to take. But it's fair to say there are some people on the fringes of the Tory party and of government who say, well, look, you probably win it. And if you have another referendum and you win it, then you probably close the argument down. And they look to Quebec for that rationale. So Quebec had a referendum in 1980, and then they had another one in, I think it was 1994, where the margin of victory was wafer thin. It was 50.5 to 49.5. But despite that margin of victory being so thin, it was seen to be the end of that debate. It was a kind of, shame on you if you fool me once, shame on me if you fool me twice scenario, whereby there was really no appetite after that for another referendum on sovereignty, as they call it over there for Quebec. And I think there's a reasonable likelihood that after IndyRef 2, if the SNP then started to make manifesto pledges about IndyRef 3, I think there's a reasonable chance that some of the more centrist voters who currently give their vote to the SNP will be turned off and will look for somewhere else to go, because they'll simply say, look, we're not the sort of people who go on marches and wave flags and get saltires tattooed on our legs. That's not what we are. We are people who generally, on the balance of risk and reward, think that independence would be better, but we are not dyed-in-the-wool, cufflink-wearing nationalists. And actually, we'd probably rather that you just focused on something else now. You've had 2 goes at it and you've lost. There is quite a body of people who will think that way. And I think that going for IndyRef 3 after losing IndyRef 2 could really be potentially quite damaging in the long term for the SNP, and that will be very much in their thoughts as well. So I think it would be a very bold strategy for the UK government. Because of that, I don't think they'll do it, but there is a lot of merit in thinking about it, and there's every chance that exactly what the questioner has outlined would actually be what would happen.
Thank you. Similar note, in the event of there being an independence vote that does go through, what do you think it would do to the SNP? Would they stay the biggest party as they are just now, or would that change?
Yeah, you could ask 2 people that question in the SNP and get 4 different answers. There is probably a working presumption that the SNP would pretty much stay in place as it is. The bulk of the elected members of the SNP are what you would basically call a European social democratic outfit. And whether they remained, whether they were still called the SNP or whether they were called something else, it's likely that they would, at least in the short term, form the kind of primary party of the centre left. There will be some exceptions to that. The role of the Labour Party would be interesting at that point. But I think the prospect of them completely disintegrating and simply going away and just joining other existing parties is probably not going to happen. I think that some sort of large party would emerge from the SNP and would probably win at least the first election under Independent Scotland. And it would, I think in many ways, it'd be more for the other parties to work out what to do rather than for the SNP. So Labour and the Tories would have to work out very quickly what side of this negotiation they were actually on. If there was a yes vote for independence, would the Tories and Labour instantly pivot to being Scottish-only parties and to say, well, we've had a yes vote, so we're going to have independence, so now we need to prepare for life in independent Scotland, and we're going to create a political party that can win, or whether they would continue to kind of fight over the battle that had already been lost, which would really open up the territory for the SNP just to continue in government almost in a kind of ANC type way. So I think the likelihood is that the bulk of it would stay in place and would probably win at least the first election after independence.
Thank you. A similar question, actually, just not specifically around independence, but just the Scottish vote in general. Somebody's asked who is most likely to present a real challenge to the SNP in coming years, Labour or the Tories?
That's very much dependent on when and if there is a second independence referendum. So at the moment, the reason the Tories are the primary challenger to the SNP is because 9 out of 10 people in Scotland base their vote on constitutionalism. So people are voting based on the party that most closely aligns to their constitutional vision. And the SNP and the Tories stand at opposite sides of the road in this respect. So if you are pro-independence, the obvious place to go is the SNP. And if you dislike independence and want to stop IndyRef 2, the obvious place to go is the Tories, because they've effectively become a single issue party on that basis. Labour can't afford to take that strict a line on independence, because about a third of their voters might vote yes. They're not as clearly unionist voters as the Tories are. So they have to maintain a kind of midway point in this debate. And, you know, when you stand in the middle of the road, you get squashed. And that's what's been happening to Labour. So although Anas Sarwar himself has better approval ratings and polls better than Douglas Ross, the party doesn't, because they're not seen to be in the right place by unionists on this debate. So that's why right now the Tories are the main challengers, and probably will be all the way up until there is a second independence referendum. I don't think Labour will come onto their own until afterwards. All of that being said, I think there's good reason to believe that the party which will challenge the SNP in government may not exist yet. This is an argument I've made quite a lot in newspaper columns and in the past as well. And again, I look to Canada for this, actually, and Quebec for this. One of the reasons why power in the Assembly of Quebec changes hands quite regularly is that the parties that don't support independence are also Quebec-only parties. They're not federal parties that have Quebec branches. They only operate in Quebec. So the Parti Québécois, which is the main separatist independence party, are unable to point to those other parties and say, you're just doing Ottawa's work in Quebec, you're just Canadian nationalists, you're not for us, because they're actually Quebec-only parties. And I think there will be a gradual realisation in the Tories. The Tories have had this argument before, 10 years ago, with a negative outcome from that point of view. And in Labour, that if they continue to be so closely aligned and so closely tied to the parties in Westminster, it's not actually doing them any favours, because voters, even unionist voters in Scotland, are increasingly looking for parties that will be pro-Scottish and do the right thing for Scotland and not be tied to Westminster. And I think that the ties to Westminster, especially in the case of the Tories with Boris Johnson being Prime Minister, effectively place a ceiling on their potential support, and probably prevent them from ever making it into government in Scotland, because those ties are as they are, and because voting patterns in Scotland are as they are. So I think there's really no reason to think there'll be a challenge to the SNP anytime soon. And it would have to take some sort of seismic political shift, which happens sometimes. You never know what's going to be around the corner, but it would have to take some sort of seismic political shift for anybody other than the SNP to win the 2026 election, and probably even the 2031 election as well.
Okay. Thank you. Just move on to the question that was asked whilst you were going through the presentation, Andy. Graham's asked, in light of COP26 and the groundswell of support for all matters environmental, what do you see changing in the relationship between SNP and Greens? Does it increase or decrease the influence of Greens on policy?
I think that COP26 can be seen as a bit of a peak. If you could track low carbon environmental policy on a graph, it would be slowly increasing, and then it would very rapidly go up right around about COP26. Then it will come back down again, but the level it comes back down to will be higher than the level it went into COP in. So we're right at the peak of kind of COP frenzy. That's why you get announcements like Cambo. That's why you start to get skepticism about blue hydrogen, skepticism about carbon capture and storage, agitation for the transition to go faster to net zero, and so on and so on. That will settle. I'm fairly certain it will settle, but it will settle at a higher level. And I think because of that, you have to presume that the drip effect of having Greens in government will be that it will push the SNP into a transition that's perhaps uncomfortably fast for it, a transition that would risk putting jobs at risk and would create economic risk beyond what they probably were prepared to swallow before. And that'll be in areas like electric vehicles to a degree, although the market is taking care of most of that. Zero carbon buildings, which is Patrick Harvey's portfolio. I think movement towards zero carbon buildings, issues with boilers and so on, you might see that moving up the agenda faster. Oil and gas will remain a big issue. It's not just Cambo, it's also about extraction from fields that have already been approved. It's also about carbon capture and storage. So I think there's certainly a risk that SNP policy could move more towards the Greens on some of those issues at the margins. And they'll feel that they need to do that in order to hold the cooperation agreement together. Because on this issue, the Greens' power is quite inflated at this point. So yeah, sorry, a long answer, but the short version being yes, the Greens will continue to have an impact on that policy.
Okay, thank you. On a related note, how do you think Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon both came out of COP26 and their sort of respective comments and discussion around it?
I think this is where the Frank Luntz argument about Boris Johnson almost has an inverse effect on the government, actually, because the person who came out of COP26 best was Alok Sharma, UK government minister who is the president of COP26. He came out of it exceptionally well, but because the UK government, because other cabinet secretaries and ministers in the UK government are so overshadowed by Boris Johnson, it almost goes unnoticed. I think Boris and Nicola came out of COP26 in the way that I suppose beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? And I think they came out of it the way that their supporters and detractors want them to come out of it. Ultimately, I think it was probably neutral on both sides. So from Boris's point of view, those who are quite supportive of Boris will point to him and say, look, he's the greenest prime minister there's ever been. He's delivered the Glasgow Climate Pact, which, although imperfect, does move us on a little bit. He delivered a successful COP. He was there and he was present. His detractors will say he flew up and down on private jets and went to posh dinners when he was back down in London, and actually he should have come back up to stop India and China from changing the coal agreement and so on. Similarly with Nicola Sturgeon, her supporters will say she was there much more than Boris Johnson. She was the leading figure at COP. Look at all the pictures that she had taken with, whoever it may be, with John Kerry and with Joe Biden, and with a variety of other, Greta Thunberg and a variety of other influential campaigners and so on. She's leading the way. Her detractors will say all she was doing was in selfie mode and embarrassing herself by trying to have a picture taken with various celebrities. So, my fairly impartial view would be that they both came out of it relatively neutral, probably both better than when they went into it. But when you speak to people who are more partial than me, you'll get a very much clearer view on that. Oh, have you got me?
You still there, Andy?
Yeah, I'm here. If you've got me.
Oh, there we are. Sorry, I think we just lost you.
Yeah. Sorry, hope you got the end of that, but yeah, that's fine.
Conscious of time, so we'll wrap things up there, but just a couple of quick thank yous. Firstly to yourself, Andy, thank you very much for taking the time to do that today. It was very interesting and informative. I hope everybody else found the same. And thanks to everybody that's come along and watched. We appreciate you coming along. And just a final note to say that we'll be doing various other webinars and face-to-face events hopefully in 2022. So if you keep an eye on Carbon Financial's social media, we'll put announcements up there and hopefully see you all ideally face-to-face or possibly on webinars as well next year. Thanks, Ian. Bye-bye.